Okay, well, my name's Eric Butters. I'm involved with the MD of Bighorn's Heritage Resource Committee. I have the privilege today, which today being the 17th of December 2012, to be in the living room of Doug and Jill Richards to interview Doug about his family and his family's history and various other anecdotes that he might be able to provide for us. So thank you very much, Doug, for agreeing to participate in this. And I guess we probably should start at the beginning about your grandfather and when he came and from where and why and what he did when he got here.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're here. And what? You're going to get up there and lay down? Yes. Well, I guess at the beginning, my great uncle came out here in 1902 with a fellow by the name of George Hatt. And they started a sawmill on the Morley Indian Reserve on the south side of the Bow River, east of Morley, in there someplace. And then in 1903, my great uncle talked my grandfather into coming out here with him. And my grandfather bought out George Hatt and George Hatt's interest in the mill, and they moved the mill to the north side of the Morley Indian Reserve, north of the Bow River, not too far north of where the McDougall Church stands now, up there in the hill beside a little lake. It's called Bassett Lake, and I believe at that time that they weren't very far from where there was or had been a Hudson Bay trading post. And McDougall's had built a fort in there when they came here and started their missionary work in the 1800s. And they logged there on the Indian Reserve. And from then until about the mid-1900s, or the mid-1915, somewhere in there was a recession in this country, and they pretty well went broke, the lumber business. Well, in the meantime, before that, they had also formed another partnership with a fellow in Calgary at the city planing mills, and he used to supply all lumber for building boxes and stuff in there. And then the Depression hit just before the First World War, and things, from what I've gathered from the old letters and journals that I have, things weren't very good. And my grandfather moved his family out here in 1904. And at that time, I believe there was 7 kids in the family eventually. I think there was 4 were born then, or born before they came here. 3 were born here. My father was born in the mill house where the mill sat in 1909. He was born there, and then there was another girl and another boy. Uncle Bill was born, I think, in 1913. And it wasn't long after that the Depression hit. My grandmother died, and I don't know quite what they did for a little bit of a living in there. I guess they did operate the mill for a while, and into the late teens, and then I think it burnt down in about somewhere around 1920s, 21, somewhere in there. I think the mill burnt down.
So your grandfather was left alone raising 7 kids.
7 kids, yeah.
That was a bit of a trial, I suspect.
Yeah, I would imagine. The oldest one, Uncle Audley, was born in 1898, so I guess he'd have been about 16 or 17 when my grandmother died. But I don't know just how they kind of got through those kind of years. I know the girls, a couple of the older ones, they kind of moved to Calgary. My father, I know, spent, him and Uncle Bill spent several years in the Salvation Army home in Calgary for a time.
For the record, could you just give us the names of the kids, if you can remember them off?
Your grandfather?
Yep. There was Audley, Edgar, Hazel, Gladys, Dad, who was James, Agnes, and Bill.
Wow.
They were the 7.
So the 4 boys sort of stuck around this community quite a bit, where the girls tended to make their lives somewhere else, I think.
Yeah. 4 boys pretty well stayed here. Girls moved to Calgary. And I know that they kind of, Hazel and Gladys, and probably Gladys had quite, my Aunt Gladys had quite a bit to do with kind of raising some of the other kids when they were younger. And I know Uncle Bill stayed with Gladys and Agnes and finished his high school in Calgary. Dad, I think, went as far as grade 6. Where he acquired all his education, I'm not sure. They might have had a governess at the mill from time to time, but he never spoke much about that. Never asked him much either, I guess.
So your dad, 1909, so he'd be working age into the late 20s and 30s, I guess, and he just did what he could around here.
Yeah.
Bill was the youngest one.
He was the youngest one.
He joined the army during the Second War.
Yeah, he served in the Second World War.
Brought a bride home.
Yeah, he. I'm not sure I have all of this correct, but he told me that she was from Belgium, and he had got wounded, and not heroically or anything. Another guy dropped an ammunition box on him and broke his arms.
Things
from
what
I gathered. And when I don't know if they were that badly broken, but then they didn't send you home. They kept you around recuperated, and if you were could get back in action. And I was told that by that time there was parts of Belgium, I guess, that the Allied forces had taken back from the Germans or whatever. And when they were healthy enough to work but weren't healthy enough to rejoin their group, they loaned them out to some of the farmers and that to help them with their work and their haying and their farming and looking after themselves. And he was sent to this farm, which was Mariette's dad's place. And she had been married previously, and her husband had been killed in the underground resistance during the Second World War. And he met her there and then brought her to Canada. He came back first and brought her back here later. But
so he homesteaded here and then sent for her? Is that the way it worked?
He had a homestead before the war. They homesteaded. My dad, Uncle Audley, and Uncle Bill took up homesteads here. Matter of fact, Uncle Bill's homestead is next quarter, kitty corner to this one. And Uncle Audley's is half a mile south here, where my cousin lives now. And they took those homesteads up in 35. And I was poking around in some stuff the other day, and I did find the receipt that the government had sent my dad for his $10 deposit for his homestead fees when he filed out here. And that was in 34.
Wow. So Bill sent for Mariette. Can you tell us a little bit about her trip out here?
Well, she came in 1946 when she came here. She came the year I was born, because I was born on February 24th, 1946. And she came here that spring. And I don't know, but I would assume she must have came on the ship to eastern Canada somewhere, and then on the train. And then they got to the train at Morley. And Uncle Bill knew he was coming, and he had taught an Indian fellow down here how to...
What was Walking Buffalo?
Yeah, Chief Walking Buffalo. To say a few words in French to welcome Aunt Mariette to Canada. So she got off the train at Morley, which I guess probably to a girl from downtown Belgium was probably quite a trip in its own right. And when she got off, he went up and welcomed her to Canada in French. And Uncle Bill picked her up there at the train. But knowing my Aunt Mariette, she was a feisty lady, so too much would have bothered her, I don't think.
Well, so many Europeans have no concept of how big Canada is, so she probably was in for a lot more of a train ride than she bargained for, and then be met by basically an entourage of cowboys and Indians.
Yeah. And actually barely being able to speak any English either
Well,
when she came here.
well, that's interesting. Your dad homesteaded 34, did you say?
I think he filed in 34, but I don't think they got the patent till 35. That receipt that I found said 1934 is when he sent in his $10. So when all the paperwork was done, maybe 35.
Great. And had he met your mom by this time? Or
Yes.
When did they meet and when did they get married?
I think he first met my mother in about 1931 when she was teaching school. She'd gone through normal school and she was teaching, and I believe she was staying over in Jameson Road at the Sandy Jameson place, and then every day she would ride over to what they called the Laycock place and taught the Lauder kids, Tom Lauder, who was the ancestor of all the famous chuck wagon
No.
people.
Well,
And they met there, and they didn't get married till 1937.
where did Tilly Zuccolo, she was
Mhm.
then, she grew up where?
North of Cochrane. They came here, her parents actually immigrated here from Italy, and they'd gone through and had settled in BC at a place called Perry Siding, and Lemon Creek and all that over in the Slocan Valley. I don't think probably any of those little names even exist anymore. And he worked for the railroad, and then he had a brother, I think, that had came to this country. They went looking around, and then Grandpa Tom, he bought a section. I don't know whether he bought it all at once or in two pieces, but he bought a section of land north of Cochrane, just south of the Westbrook School and west a couple of miles, between Highway 22 and Horse Creek Road, on that crossroad. And my mother was, she was born in BC, but there were 7 kids in her family, and a couple of them were born here in Alberta, but they came here, I think, 1919.
Well,
And the first house that they stayed in till they got moved to the farm was actually, well, it is gone now, the house where they stayed in Cochrane. But it was the lot had been sold, and it was where Eddie Pears lived
yeah.
at the end. And that place became a latte coffee shop, and now it's a computer
Yeah.
shop or something, right? But the house sat on that corner, and they lived in that house before they moved out to the farm.
So what year did your mom and dad get married then?
1937,
And they,
October 27th, 1937.
1937, and then they moved on to your dad's homestead.
No, after they got married, they spent 4 or 5 years in the summertime working for Fred Brewster out of the Black Cat Ranch, taking out hunting parties and that in Jasper. And then they would winter here, but they didn't have a cabin here on this homestead at that time, but my Uncle Bill had a cabin on his quarter. And so they used to winter there. And then I think it was about 43, they bought a cabin from down on the Ghost that I believe Guy Gibson had built, or had somebody else build it for him.
Log cabin.
And I think my mother said she paid $10 or $20 for it. I'm not sure now. And they took it down and hauled it up here and set it up here, and then moved here. My sister was born in 1943, and then they were moved into the cabin about that time when she was born.
So that started a fairly long relationship that your parents had with Bruce. I think your mom loved to do that sort of backcountry cooking and outfitting and stuff.
Yeah.
didn't she?
And in later years, she cooked, I don't know how many years, but she cooked quite a few summers for the trail riders of the Canadian, or the trail hikers. She cooked for the trail riders too, and the trail hikers of the Canadian Rockies in the summer.
So they packed the camps and the hikers hiked.
Yeah. Or with the trail riders, well, the trail riders rode in, but back then there might be 5 trail rides during the summer and 2 hike camps. So there'd be 7 weeks. But they never had the hike camp in the same place as the trail ride camp. So they would take in a couple of hikes, or a couple of trail rides, And then you would tear all the camp down, move it to another location, and set it up for the hikers. And then when they were done after 2 weeks, they would tear it all down and bring it back and set it up for the trail riders, the Canadian Rockies.
Well, so when you and your sister effectively born here and grew up here,
Yeah.
how about this? You must have correspondence school. Right?
Yeah, I took what education I knew have, all by correspondence. My sister went to as far as grade 8 in correspondence, and then she attended Lindsay Thurber Composite High School in Red Deer and boarded up there for I think grade 9. I think she took grade 9 up there. 9 or 10, I forget just now. And then she came back here, and I know she spent one winter, I think it was when she took grade 11, she spent it with your grandparents. And helped out with the chores around there, and then your Grandma Jean helped her with her schoolwork. And then in grade 12, she went to Cochrane and boarded with Aunt Katie and took her grade 12 in Cochrane.
Well, so of course, there's no mail delivery, so you had to get the lessons to and from Morley?
Morley, our address was Morley then, yeah.
Might have been a bit of a challenge in the wintertime.
Sometimes, yeah. Winters, we had easy winters and tough winters just like we have now. I do remember there would be times if you didn't get them mailed on time, you'd get notes from Edmonton about not being on time. And if we couldn't get in and out around here, I mean, sometimes we were snowed in here and blowed in by the end of October, part of November, and then you waited until snow melted in the spring, and then it wasn't just a matter of the snow melting, you had to wait for the potholes to dry up so you could get out of here. But I do remember times when my dad would saddle his horse and he'd ride down to the store at Morley and mail our lessons and pick up the mail and maybe a wedge of cheese or something, because those days they had the big old round one and you just, I want that much, and they cut it off and wrapped her up in wax paper and brown paper and maybe the odd other little grocery and ride home again.
So with winter, is that difficult to deal with the absence of good roads and the rest? There's probably one big fall shopping trip, was there, for groceries?
Yes, they would go, at that time there was a place in downtown Calgary down on 10th Avenue and down there somewhere called Williams Brothers. And they used to sell furniture and groceries and everything. And in the fall, before they figured maybe that we couldn't get out, they would go down to Williams Brothers and lay in one big supply of groceries for the winter of what we needed. But my mother always had a garden, and there was always some poor moose would stumble and fall down in the yard too.
A little bit of wild meat, a little bit of garden.
Garden.
Probably, I think, the best rhubarb patch in the country.
Yes. My mother loved the rhubarb patch, and she had a big one of that, and did a lot of canning. Put everything up. Had a little cellar under the cabin down there, and put all that up. And
So she's the one that taught you how to make rhubarb pies?
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of famous, too.
And one other thing back then, one of the big excitements of the year was we'd get the order out of the Eaton's catalog probably every year just before Christmas. And we'd always wait for that big parcel and hope the road didn't get too bad so you could get out to get it.
Tell me about Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner. Was that a big thing with extended family, or just your own intimate family? Or did you raise turkeys? Or
No, my mother always had chickens. She always raised chickens and canned them and whatever, but we never had a turkey. She tried geese a time or two, but the coyotes seemed to like them. But this Thanksgiving dinners, no, they wouldn't be too big. They'd probably consist of our family, and there was only the two in our family, my sister and myself, Wendy, myself, Mom and Dad. Uncle Bill and Aunt Mariette would come quite often, or Mom's folks and Aunt Katie. Back then, my Mom's folks still lived with Aunt Katie, one of their daughters in Cochrane, and they would come out. And Christmas was kind of the same, or we might go to one of their places, go into Cochrane for Christmas, depending on the roads, the weather.
Milk cows?
Oh yeah.
Ship cream?
Always had a milk cow, and then in the summertime, that was kind of what kept everybody alive, with milk cows, and shipped the cream, and it got taken down to Morley, put on the train, and went into Swift's in Calgary, and then in later years, San Pedro, if we were going to Cochrane, we take it into there, and milk cows, and that was kind of my sister and I's job when we were kids, was to gather the milk cows morning and night, and the country wasn't that well fenced at that time, and the saddle horses, Dad always had his saddle horse pretty close to hand, but there didn't seem to be enough grass for anybody else's. So half the time it was a decide. Should I walk and look for my saddle horse, or walk first and walk and look for the milk cows? I probably spent more time walking and looking for the saddle horse or the milk cows than I ever did doing anything else. But we had bells on them, but sometimes they get laid down, you couldn't hear them. You might ride for hours and not find them.
Wow. Now, sometimes you'd be pretty isolated in the winter, or even in the summer is a long time to the doctor. I mean, are you pretty healthy most of the time, or do you have any issues getting out to the doctor or to the hospital?
No, I believe, I'm not sure what year it was, my sister was 3 or 4, I'm thinking, and not quite positive on that one. She had an appendicitis attack during the winter, in February or sometime, I think, and they took her with the team and sleigh to Morley, and then put her on the train with my mother, and went in and stayed with my aunt Hazel in Calgary while she was in the hospital. But other than that, I don't ever remember
Going to
the doctor, being sick.
Well, you wouldn't be bringing the bug home from daycare anyway.
No.
That's for sure.
But it's kind of funny and stuff like that when you're young, and they talk about stuff and you get a different perception. I can remember when the polio outbreak was a big scare and a big thing around town. Of course, we didn't go to town much. But I can still remember, and I guess I was old enough to have heard it on the radio, and we were going into Calgary one day in the summer, and they said there had been about 9 cases of polio in Calgary. I don't remember if that was the number, but there had been several cases of polio. And I didn't know what polio was, so when we went in there, I spent most of my time when we were driving around looking for these cases, because I thought maybe they just sat on the sidewalk. I wasn't very old then, probably 4 or 5, but I didn't realize.
When did the big fire threat here? Big fire came near here, didn't it?
Yes, spring of 1943, there was a fire started just on the other side of Kanginas Lake here from a lightning strike, and burnt off a lot of Pringle Mountain. But due to the prevailing winds, it did not come this way. But they thought it might. There was a lot of smoke, and so my mother, she packed up all the dishes and that out of the cabin, and there's a little lake down here. She took them down and put them all in the lake and put rocks on them so they wouldn't float away, and figured they'd have that much left if the fire changed and came, and they had to leave, came this way, but it didn't.
Fortunately, it didn't.
There, yeah.
What can you talk about the sort of the social life in there? I mean, there was house parties occasionally, and
Yeah.
What do you remember yourself, or remember hearing about those kind of deals?
Well, I don't know if we attended too many, like, of course, once we were kids, because it was, if the road was bad, it was just too far to go with a team and sleigh. But if the roads were good, I know they used to have, it was kind of a big deal. I was probably 6, 8 years old then. And Sandy Jameson used to have a New Year's party. That was kind of the big thing in the deal. So we'd all go over to Sandy Jameson's, and I don't really remember. I guess there was somebody knew how to play music, but the only thing I really remember about those parties, because of course they'd put you to bed in the bedroom, but that wasn't, you're that age, you're not kind of too inclined to lay too still too long. But I can still remember there was a fellow in the country by the name of Walter Lyons, and he used to play the fiddle. And he liked to drink a little bit too, and he had quite a repertoire of songs they could play, and everybody, they'd move the furniture out of the living room or whatever and dance in there. Walter'd be playing the fiddle. And I can remember one time I was there and he was leaning against the door jamb, and the drunker Walter got, well, the less he remembered of his repertoire of fiddle songs. And by the end of the night, all he could remember was Rubber Dolly. And he's leaning up against the door jamb. And there's about 2 hairs left on the bow of the fiddle. And his eyes are shut, and he's playing Rubber Dolly on the fiddle.
Now, your dad knew some of the Stoney chants and whatnot.
Yeah, that was kind of a big deal too. Another kind of a thing that people in this little area looked forward to. There was a fellow had a cabin down by the Ghost Village down there by the name of John Tynan, and he owned Tynan's Can't Sag Furniture, and his big deal was to have a Boxing Day party. So if the weather was good, he invited all the local neighbors and that, and we all went down there. And actually one of his daughters and a friend of hers, Dr. Isabel Stevenson, were friends of my mother's their entire life. And we'd go down there for those parties, and of course the big thing was if they could get the Richards brothers together with a wash tub, and then they would start beating on this wash tub and then singing the Indian songs and doing the chicken dance around the wash tub. That was usually happened at every get-together. Sooner or later one of them would be beating on the wash tub.
Wow. Well, it's such a delight to hear the reminiscences about your mom and dad. They're probably the most revered and respected people ever lived in this community, and it's a delight to have some of their story recorded. They had a pretty frugal life, as everyone did in this community, but they had a happy life, didn't they?
Yep. No, I mean, I never realized that we were considered poor till I grew up and left home. The cabin is still sits down here. The floor joists under it are pretty well rotted out. I mean, it's getting to the point where
Jimmy's gonna fix it up.
going to have to jack it up and put some new joists under it or do something. But it probably wasn't as big as this living room.
No.
It was 18 by 22, I think, and this living room's 18 by 24. And there was one bedroom and the kitchen, living room, pantry, wood burning stove. If the weather got really cold, we had a heater we'd put in there.
No power? No.
No, we never had. We never got a phone, I think, till about 66 or 7, and that's about the time we got the power in here. Although we did have a light plant that we acquired. That to begin with was a 32-volt light plant, but I was pretty well grown up even then.
Your dad got involved with the ID at the time, the improvement
Yeah.
district at the time, roundabout. When?
In the 70s,
In the 70s.
I'm thinking. I'm not exactly sure of the year, but well, maybe even the 60s.
60s,
Because he served there.
before
Yes,
we were married.
because I can remember him going to one of the meetings, spring meetings, when they used to, counselors and all that, used to have to meet in Edmonton. Probably still do. And it was 1967, and they went over to visit one of my mother's sisters that lived out towards Newbrook, Vilna country. And they came back with some pictures, and they'd had a terrible winter, the snow up there. But all you could see was the power lines sticking up out of the snowbanks on the sides of the road. And that was 67, so it would have been in the 60s sometime.
Of course, your dad called the square dance sort of the
Mhm.
floor manager at the dances and parties in homes and community halls.
Oh yeah, he loved to do that. Both my parents loved to dance, and I guess it's true that some things skip a generation.
It's absolutely true.
I could, getting off the subject, but a few years ago here I had to have a hip replacement. So when I went back in for my one checkup, this doctor I had, and of course they're always so busy, they in a hurry and don't like to chat much. So anyway, he comes through there and I'd had my x-ray, and he said, well, your hip's really good. He said, but I just want you to remember, he said, you got to be careful. He said, there's some things I don't want you doing too much of. He said, I don't want you running, jumping, and lifting anything heavy or horseback riding.
What's left?
Kind of what I thought. So as he's heading out the door, I looked at him and I said, well, can I dance? And he said, oh yeah, you can dance. And I said, that's good, because I couldn't before. And he just kind of gave me a, kind of, what rock did this guy crawl out of, and left.
Well, then after your dad's involvement with after his passing, I guess, your mom started to fulfill the role. So
Yeah.
was she on the hospital board as well as your dad, or just the council?
Yeah, I
On
think
both?
she was
yeah,
on the hospital.
'cause
They were
Dad
both
was
on both. weren't they?
on both for a while, yeah.
Yeah,
No, and I know Dad. They both enjoyed that. I know my dad did, and getting back to what you'd asked earlier, but that was one of the big deals at all the little local dances or whatever we'd have then, was calling the square dances. And if they were short, well, Dad, he'd dance and call them at the same time.
Yeah.
Sweat would be a pouring off him, and he'd go all night.
Yeah, oh yeah, and they'd be hollering. I can remember a number of those would be hollering, "What's the matter with you young fellas?"
Yeah, get up here and dance. What's the matter with you young guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we had a square dance club for a while in this country, and we rented various little halls, or we used to go down to Morley or Beaupre or rent a little hall, and we'd have square dances about once a month. Well, we did other things, tried the square dance, Shawtish or the Virginia Reel, and stuff like that. And I don't know, we seemed to have a lot of fun.
Did lots of things up in Morley.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, it was a lot of hard work, but there was time to have a little fun once in a while. Of course, your dad rodeo too, didn't he? A little
Yeah.
bit early on?
Yeah, he rode bucking horses. He didn't travel near as much as I did, and I haven't traveled near as much as my one son did. But back then, there wasn't a lot of rodeos that close to home. And Calgary, of course, was a big one. He competed in Calgary for 5 or 6 years. And I know that one time, him and your grandparents and that, they took their saddle horses and took up pack horses and rode up to Sundre for the rodeo, because Sundre was always a big 1 or 2 day rodeo there in July, I think.
What would it be? A couple-day ride, 3-day ride up there?
A couple of days, I would guess, yeah. It's really not that far when you look at how the crow flies.
Yeah,
but
not too many fences.
not too many fences. But
Wow. So you and Wendy got involved with 4-H too, didn't you, when
Yeah.
you were kids?
yes, back in the 50s, I believe it was, I think 1955, Shorty Hensman started a 4. He was the starter, the push, and the first leader of our 4-H club. And I think it might have been, no, it was 50. It was the spring of 55, because they had the organizational meeting at his place, and Dad wasn't home because, well, I could be wrong, might have been 56. Because it was somewhere, I thought it was about 1955, the seismic came into this country and pushed lines everywhere, and Dad and Rule Dawson and Jack Harris got the contract to clean up all the seismic lines. And they also got to do some down in the Jumping Pound district, and he wasn't around much. And Mom took us down to this meeting, and I remember it was in February. And I don't know how they quite got around it. They didn't have quite enough kids to form a club. They needed one more.
And you were too
And
young.
they allowed me to join as a special peewee because I was a year too young.
You had to be 10.
And that was in February, and we hadn't even weaned yet. The cows and that, we had such an open winter, everything was still grazing out. And Dad got back from clearing these seismic lines, and it was around the end of February, and we weaned the cows and tied a couple of calves to the fence, and halter broke them. And
do you remember who else was in the club in those days?
yeah, all the big kids were at that time.
Stan.
Paul and Sally Austin, George Spicer. He was probably about the oldest one. I think he was only about a year, but then he ended up being our leader when he was too old to be in 4-H for a year. So George Spicer was in, my sister.
It's in the
But
4-H.
you had to
I
go
know
the
Dennis
furthest.
Flendra was in.
By double, probably, or triple as far. I mean, it's when you live at the end of the road, it's always a long ways anywhere.
Yeah. And I don't know, having them 4-H calves around is about as bad as having milk cows. It's bad for as far as getting away and going to do anything, because back in those days, the 4-H, at least our club, well, this whole district, Cochran and everything, the big achievement day was in the middle of August when they had the big cattle show and that in. It was all held in the middle of August in Calgary. So you all have to go into Calgary in the middle of August. So you have to keep those calves around and feed them and look after them. And I guess we must have liked to create work, because the barn at that time was up on the hill. And there was corrals there, but we had some corrals down by the lake, because when we weaned the calves in the fall, then we'd just chop a hole. We'd run a fence out on the ice on the lake and chop holes for water for the cattle. Well, we thought it would be... we used to lead the calves that kept in the barn down to the water every day during the wintertime. But why we never put the calves in the corral down at the lake, but we figured they needed exercise, so the best exercise was leading them to water every day, or packing the water to the calves. Why? And
Who's getting the exercise here?
it's kind of me. But I never did figure out why we didn't put those calves in the water laying down by the lake and let them drink out of the lake, and why I hauled water in cream cans to them all summer. But, and we were in 4-H for
That's where you learn to public speak.
5, 6, maybe 10, yeah, 5, 6 years the club was, and then we ran out of not having enough kids to have a club. And yeah, that was it, and it folded.
Didn't you go to Saskatchewan or something on some trip?
Well, they did have it, the big display in Calgary. I mean, every 4-H club had to build a display, and you had to have, and of course there was awards for whoever had the best kept stalls and the nicest stalls, with, because every calf had his own name and who he was fed by and all that. But I do know they did make a display one year of on grass management, and we had 3 plots of, I don't know, they're maybe 3 or 4 feet long of sod that we had dug up. And one was where it was overgrazed, one where it was kind of well kept, and one that was undergrazed. And we'd made a bunch of cattle. And they were just small ones out of paper mache, flour, salt, paper mache. And we'd made fences all around them out of peeled willow sticks and posts and that for these things, and then the write-up on what the benefits of grazing, and the Cochrane Club won the award that year, and they sent them off to Regina for the Nationals later on that year with that display.
Wow.
And we got to first place in Calgary. And I think might have been the first year I was in 4-H, probably the best we ever did in there. I did end up with the 3rd best steer in the Pee Wee division in Calgary.
So packing water was worth it in the end to some extent.
I guess so, yeah. Didn't wear any fat. Didn't want to wear any fat off them. Leave
No.
them. Well, not only that, at that time of the year, if you had to leave them in the water, if they wanted to go mucking and running across the field, we weren't big enough to hold them anyway. And who knows how long it was going to take to get them back, so it was safer to keep them in the corral, I guess, to pack the water to.